We started this series called Why Ask, and it's really for a variety of people. Like for those of you that you don't really know where you're at on your spiritual journey and you're not really sure what you believe about Jesus, but the fact of the matter is, believing in a personal God who cares about you, okay, that feels good. Believing in a God who can intervene in world affairs and make a difference should people ask him to, frankly, that makes faith harder for you. Because it raises all kinds of questions like, if he could, why doesn't he? And why is it so arbitrary? And when does he? And it just makes it hard. And oftentimes, even Christians in their spiritual journey, we just avoid this conversation of prayer because it's so incredibly complex, not nearly as black and white as it's often presented as. And so we went we think probably a lot of us are thinking about this. Let's go there. Some of you, probably many of you who follow Jesus, I guess I'm assuming that as we talk about living this organic kingdom life, as we talk about Jesus not being nearly as religious and ceremonial as we've often been told that he is, and we strip away lots of stuff and we invite ourselves to live our ordinary everyday lives, I guess the assumption that I'm making is that in that process and in that freedom and in that permission and in that new kind of vision can also develop kind of a sloppiness with regards to prayer. Because it's easier to pray and pray often and pray consistently when you live a hyper-religious life, when everything is about returning to a certain building and doing certain acts. It's difficult when you're just scattered and invited to matter and seize opportunities as they come. Maybe you're someone that's convinced you should pray, but have kind of lost track of the why or the how or the when. And maybe for you, because of illness or because of a friend or because of a family member or because of this desire that keeps getting unmet, for you, prayer is a very frustrating, well, let's just leave it there. It makes you mad because it's so frustrating. And so we just said, let's talk about that. Maybe you can relate to a friend of mine, a gal who's lived a lot of life and survived cancer, sent me this email a couple weeks ago, a week and a half ago. I was thinking about the Why Ask theme this week. I'm very interested in this series, as I do have lots of questions. Why do bad things still happen when we pray for them not to? I look around up at Rocky Mountain Care Center and wonder, retirement facility, right? Why do these people, who I know have faith, have to live in such misery at the end of their lives? Good lives, good people. Why so much suffering when they pray for peace? Why does my friend whose young son has health problems and has many people praying for him have to endure another painful surgery? Why are those prayers not answered, or why is the answer no? I hate those well-meaning remarks from friends like, God doesn't give you what you can't handle, or God must have a reason, or God is trying to teach you something. I just want to say, really? Maybe that makes them feel better. But being an analytical person, I'm trying to find that reason or what it is that he's trying to teach me. I ask him those questions all the time. I know that not everything is going to be good all the time. Bad things happen. But then why ask for them not to? Maybe you can relate to that, and that's really what we're doing in this series. And I just want to re-say, this series is an attempt to offer this really exhaustive theological look at prayer. The nuances of prayer in the scriptures are intense. There are a lot of them. In no way have I claimed that we're going to offer this very systematic scriptural look at prayer and the different ways it's practiced, largely because I'm not that detail-orientated, nor am I that studious, nor am I that intelligent, nor am I convinced that that's really where we're at personally. The way I've approached this and the way I've invited us to approach this is, what if we just pretended like we've never heard of prayer before? And what if we were to open to the scriptures and just look at Jesus' life for just a moment and begin to go, how did he understand prayer? What was it about, and why do we do it, and why did he do it? Because he was God and the most intelligent person to ever live, certainly more, but definitely not less, and yet he prayed. So what's the deal with prayer? And so in the last week, I feel like I did a terrible job of communicating this last week, but what we were trying to communicate last week is that God is a God who wants to hear our desires. There's this cliche thing that everyone likes to lob bombs at, that God is a vending machine, and we all have heard that, and we've all been guilty of that, and it's gross, you're right. But the fact of the matter is, it's really only 1 degree off, which is true of most falsehood, right? Because God is a God who wants to know our desires. And what we explored last week through the words of Paul and the words of Jesus is that some very supernatural things happen when we take the time to just verbalize our desires to God. We talked about them being pure or impure, holy or unholy, something we're proud of or not. That when we begin to just articulate, God, here are my desires, some supernatural things happen. Sometimes desires that we know we shouldn't have, our grip loosens. Sometimes God meets those desires, because as Peter said, like cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. And sometimes it just becomes emotionally easier to endure the disappointment when we've taken the time to articulate, okay, God, this is a desire. This week, if last week was part 1, I think this week is part 1A, and probably this week is part 1 and last week was part 1A, because these two are so closely married. This week I just want to talk about this idea that prayer communicates trust. And you can see already how, like, I'm kind of, this week I was like, why did I pick this order? Because trust probably becomes first. Like, that, what if at the foundational level are these kind of two coexisting ideas that prayer communicates desire and prayer communicates trust? I mean, what if we can start there? Because, well, let's just look at some different verses. What we're going to do is there's a verse that I've picked on, indicted you by saying we, but that's only out of insecurity. We've picked on it a lot. This verse in Matthew 6:8. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask. Which raises a really rational, really reasonable question. Well, if he already knows what I need before I ask, then why bother, right? The sentiment of that is echoed throughout the Gospels. In fact, at one instance in Jesus' life, some of his biggest critics, some of his biggest adversaries came to him and they're indicting his entire movement, like, I can't believe you guys have ales for trails, something like that. What they say is this: John's disciples often, speaking of John the Baptist, his disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. But yours go on eating and drinking. Here's some good news. Like, if you live in perpetual guilt because you don't pray enough, your company is the disciples. It's Jesus himself, who we find repeated instances in the Gospels of people going, you're not spiritual enough. And what they meant was, you're not praying enough, you're not doing those overt outward practices enough. I mean, if you're someone that lives in this perpetual guilt, you have good company. Or, if you're a doer, like you're someone that has a hard time praying because, like, you don't believe in a God who, right, like you were raised your kids, or maybe you were raised with this, like, God doesn't help those who don't help themselves, right? Like, you've got that, like, you're a Montana and you're like, you do something about it. You don't sit around and pray all day. Like, pray and get up and do something. Good news is, it would seem that Jesus' movement kind of agrees that he's guilty of not praying enough. If you're someone that have a hard time wearing grooves into the floorboards next to your bed, because you spend so much time on your knees, not that there's anything wrong with that there's not a place for that, but someone that feels guilty that you don't pray long enough and often enough and frequently enough, and you don't have long enough lists, and you don't have a long enough track record of successes. Well, the good news is, it would seem that the disciples, they share your experience. Jesus' movement and what he's going to unpack about prayer as we move forward in Matthew 6, he's like, my way of praying, my way of relating to God is way different. In fact, one of the ways he says it is this: take my yoke upon you and learn from me. From gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Now, I know we've talked about this before, but I think it's so important that I'm going to risk being repetitive. When Jesus talked about a yoke, I know we've seen the pictures of the wooden things, the wooden collars that went over oxen. I know we've heard the first century idea of that, and of course the scriptures use that image elsewhere. But the rabbinic studies that we're privy to because of things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, what they tell us is that yoke was an idiom. That it was a phrase that was common to the day, that we might use the word style or bent or preference. Like, you wear a certain brand of clothes. You prefer certain places to shop for your clothes because of the bent, because of the style, because of the makeup. If you're an artist, if you're a musician, there are certain artists that make you want to claw your eyes out, and there are certain artists that you gravitate towards. Why? It's because of bent. It's because of yoke. When you were in high school, remember there was that math teacher your freshman year that you got an A in that class, and then you got that other math teacher when you were a junior, and you got a D, and you almost got kicked out of school because you didn't like him so much, and he happened to find that out? It's yoke. It's bent. Two different teaching styles. The reason why you prefer one job over your old job, it's bent, it's yoke, it's style. If you're a sports fan, then you know that different organizations have different bents. They have different yokes. If you're a fan of the Washington Redskins, then you know that what your team does every offseason is spends inordinate amounts of money on free agents, is terrible, cuts them, leaves lots of dead money on the salary cap, and then does the same thing again next year, right? The three of you that follow football. And if you're a Pittsburgh Steelers fan or a Green Bay Packer fan, then you're on top of the world because their yoke is much different. They draft guys, they develop guys, and when they command huge salaries, they've already developed their replacement and they say goodbye to them, and the next young guy steps into their place. Jesus is saying, my yoke, my way of interacting with God, in reference to why I ask, my way of praying, is way, way different. And what I want us to do is kind of jump into the Jewish world of Jesus for about 10 minutes, because there's just a couple cultural things that we can look at that I think will bring a lot of clarity to this, like, God already knows what you need before you ask. So in Matthew 6, what precedes that famous verse is this: and when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites. So we're talking about religious people. We're talking about Jewish religious people. For they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward in full. A hypocrite would have been understood like a mime today. They were actors who painted their face white, or they wore masks. It was an acting phrase. They take on different images. What Jesus is saying is, if your way of praying is about getting the approval of others, if it's about other people seeing how spiritual you are, then good news. You get a reward for that. Bad news is your reward is your reputation. God doesn't respond to that. He goes on to say, but when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Here's the part that I want us to drill down on for a bit. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans. So now he's talking about the Greek world outside of Judaism. He's not saying this in a pejorative or a derogatory sense. Pagan is a real spiritual idea that was very prevalent in the day. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like the pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. What he's referring to there is a practice, a common practice, where if your wife was sick, or you lost your job, or you weren't sure how you were going to eat because the harvest was so poor, you went before these gods and you prayed. Plural gods. And the game was that you literally needed to list the name of as many gods as you possibly knew. It was a one-up strategy, because you didn't know what God had the power to meet this need. You didn't know what God was awake versus sleeping. Literally. You didn't know what God was feeling particularly generous towards humanity and which God was feeling indifferent that day. You didn't know who understood what you were saying or who cared about you or who were paying attention to you on that day. And so you listed a God's name and you said your request. And you listed a God's name and you said your request. And you listed a God's name and you said your request. And you listed a God's name and you sent your request. And you would do that over and over for as long as it took. And the more God's names you knew, the better your odds of having your request fulfilled. Let me show you a picture of a place called Narrate. It's less dramatic, but this is a place, this is a city, well, it was a city near the Dead Sea. Friends and I have been there on 2 separate occasions. Next picture, it's actually on top of a tell. Now, it's hard to tell. That's a rod from a distance. You can see those walls. One of the things that happens in ancient Israel is, like, a city develops because of strategic importance. So it pops up there because of a water source. It pops up there because of a military strategy. It's very pragmatic why a city ends up where it does. And so when a city was flattened, when it was conquered by one nation, it's not like you would just flatten it and move on and start your city somewhere else. You would just flatten it in the course of a victory, and you'd rebuild right on top of it. So what you're looking at looks a lot like a hill. And yet what archaeologists will tell us is, well, it is a hill, but the majority of that hill is made up of actual history. It's archaeology. It's artifacts. It's one civilization stacked on top of another. Next picture. I just want to dwell on what we were looking at there, and what you're looking at there in all of its distinction and detail, is an Israelite temple. When we were there, we were told that was an Israelite temple that dated to the time of Hezekiah. And if you're familiar with your biblical history, you know that during the time of Hezekiah, Israel was about as pure as they ever were. They obeyed about as well as they ever did. What's fascinating, though, is what's underneath that. What archaeologists are sure is underneath that is a pagan temple, a pagan altar. And the decision that archaeologists have to make every time they unearth something is, do I destroy this strata to get to the next, or do I stop here? What's underneath there, inevitably, is a temple to a god named Baal, or you might have heard it pronounced Baal, B-A-A-L. Baal, it was a sympathetic religion. And what they mean by a sympathetic religion was that in order to get Baal to respond to you, you had to do something that he liked. You had to somehow get his attention. You somehow had to do something that gathered his attention in your direction, perform in such a way that he was amused, that he was satisfied, that he liked it. You had to, we all have in our head those stereotypical kind of massive pagan gatherings, those huge festivals, right? Well, it's not just about celebration. It's like, we're over here, like pay attention to us here, because you've got to give that God something he needs or somehow appeal to him. You've got to draw attention to yourself and convince him that his need is worth your while. And you've got to show him what you want. It's not enough to just assume that he understands it. You've got to show him. Well, here's the catch. Baal, it was believed, had the seed in him. And by seed, I'm talking human fertility. I'm talking agricultural fertility, your crops, your animals. So you had to show Baal that what you wanted was to be pregnant. Because if you didn't get pregnant, your husband was going to get a new wife. You had to show Baal that if your community's fields didn't grow and you weren't able to harvest, you were going to die. You had to show him that you needed him to give the seed for your field's fertility. You had to show him that you really needed your goat to reproduce so that you had something to trade for more food. Which is why you went to temple and you copulated with animals. Because Baal needed to see what you wanted. And so you had sex with a goat. Because he needed to see it. And not just goats, but children. Because he didn't understand that what you were asking was for your wife to be pregnant. And so you showed him. This is why there were temple prostitutes. Because you went and you had these massive orgies as a community. And you were demonstrating to him, like us, we're showing you what we need. Child sacrifice would have happened just below that altar. When a child was born, there would have been a red mark put around their wrist, the first son. And what blew me away when I studied this, I was actually reading a book on it one time and had to put it down because it was just too emotionally exhausting. The firstborn son's wrist would be marked. But it's not like that he would be sacrificed that day, or even necessarily that week, or even necessarily that year, or even necessarily those 5 years. The idea was that child was marked, and at any time, that God could come, take that son, and drop him into the fiery pit and offer him, because someone needed to get Baal's attention. Someone needed to do something Baal liked, and someone needed to show Baal what they needed. It's that culture to which Jesus says this, do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask. Amazing, isn't it? This God, he already knows your needs. He already knows about your marriage. He already knows about your kids. He already knows about your joblessness. He already knows about your finances. He already knows about your emotional struggles. He already knows about your needs. Jesus says, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you'll eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more important than food, and the body more important than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow? They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon, all his splendor, was dressed like one of these. If this is how God clothes the grass in the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things. Jesus frames it, beginning and last. And your heavenly Father knows that you need them. He doesn't need you to get his attention. He doesn't need you to show him what you need. He already knows. This God's already committed to your needs. Which raises the question, okay, so Jesus, why ask? What's the point? To which my suggestion would be this: what if God finds pleasure in our communicating our trust in him? What if prayer, as much as anything else, is about affirming to God, God, I'm trusting you. God, I'm trusting you. What if God understands that something happens both relationally between him and ourselves and in our own emotional makeup when we don't just theologically say we believe, but when we stop and in the midst of worrying about a job or anything else, we go, God, I trust you. I trust you. I'm choosing to trust you. I mean, is this why Paul talks about prayer being something that we do repetitively? Right? And there's these verses, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances. In Philippians, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Does Paul understand that, like, confessing trust, it's not a one-time thing? I mean, sure, yeah, it's important when we make that decision to believe in Jesus, to acknowledge the resurrection, to believe in what he accomplished through the cross. Absolutely. Does Paul understand, though, that, like, confessing trust, speaking candidly about desire, that doesn't happen once, and it doesn't even just need to happen once a day, but that it happens with repetition every time something comes up? I would submit that we see Jesus praying this way. We see him do it when he finds out that his friend John the Baptist has been killed. John the Baptist was his cousin, one of his best friends growing up. As an adult, he associated with him. They had very different yokes, and yet they were on the same team, so to speak. And John the Baptist had a way of making the Roman authorities mad at him. And in particular, he got himself in some trouble when Herod married his brother's wife, and he kind of called foul. And Herod knew that, like, beheading John wasn't going to earn him any points because his job from Rome was to keep the peace, and that would cause an uproar, so he just threw him in jail. And then on one occasion, his wife, Herodias, her daughter, his stepdaughter, also his niece, the text says she performed a dance for him, and it pleased him mightily. Now, like, you don't have to be very cynical or a scholar to understand what we're talking about there. That there was some sort of erotic, sexual striptease thing that went on, and he was moved by his stepdaughter's sexual invitation, I suppose, or teasing. And he said to her, ask me anything you want, up to half of my kingdom. I'll give it to you. I mean, tell me, right? Like, he's responding. She goes back to her mom. Hey, Mom, check this out. She said, ask for John's head on a platter. He does. She does, excuse me. John reluctantly commands that his soldiers go behead John the Baptist. And when his disciples get to Jesus, Jesus hears about this. He's early in his own ministry, and the scriptures tell us he just disappears. He departs. Can't you imagine him shaking his fist at God? Like, Lord, how would you let that happen? Can't you imagine him beginning to fill in between the blanks and understand what was coming towards him? I mean, if they were going to behead John the Baptist, what were they going to do to him? Can't you imagine that honest agitation and frustration and fear? And yet all I can do is speculate. But his ministry took on such a new level after that I would suggest that part of what went on there must have been prayer that then went, God, I trust you. I trust you, I trust you, I trust you. I'm scared out of my gourd. I'm going to pray, because that's what prayer's about, acknowledging my trust in you. In Gethsemane, one of the more famous places of Jesus' prayer, shortly before he was arrested, it's an olive press. It's this giant word picture because he is so squeezed by pressure. The message says it this way. They came to an area called Gethsemane. Jesus told his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took Peter, James, and John with him. He plunged into a sinkhole of dreadful agony. He told them, I feel bad enough right now to die. Stay here and keep vigil with me. Going a little ahead, he fell to the ground and prayed for a way out. Papa, Father, can't you get me out of this? Humble, unpretentious, unconditional trust. Take this cup away from me. But please, not what I want. What do you want? What if prayer, as much as anything else, is designed by God because he understands how important it is for you to repeatedly acknowledge that you trust him, and to not just say it like blanket statement, generic, but when real situations cause you to worry, it sends you to prayer, not just that God would rescue you from the situations, but that you would affirm, God, I trust you. I'm trusting you. I'm trusting you. John Ortberg tells a story in a book called The Me I Want to Be about when his family was young. In the middle of the night, he found his wife's elbow in his ribs, And as men are good at, he pretended that he couldn't hear the noise that was that was causing the elbow, pulled the cover over his head. Eventually the elbow won out long enough for her to say, "Do you hear that noise?" And he said, "What noise?" And she said, "I think it's a fire alarm. Knock it off." Okay, he said, I'll check it out. So he gets up out of bed. Sure enough, there's a fire alarm going. He knew that, but whatever. He stumbles around the house, finds the fire alarm, and, okay, there's a fire alarm, but he can't smell smoke anywhere. Searches everywhere in his house, goes into his garage, can't smell any smoke. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. He goes back, he gets a chair, he climbs up on top of the chair, he reaches into the smoke alarm, he grabs the 9-volt battery and pulls it out. He crawls back into bed. His wife says, "What was it?" He said, "The fire alarm." She said, "What'd you do?" He said, "This must be broken. I took the 9-volt out of it." Okay, she said. They went back to sleep. He had to be to work really early that morning, and so just a couple hours later, he rolled out of bed and got to this very large gathering that he was headed to. And at the first break, a gal came up to him, ghost white, and said, "Are you John Ortberg?" And he said, "Yeah." "And why?" And she said, "You need to get home immediately. Your house is on fire." He got home, was relieved to see his wife and kids standing on the curb, staring at their house as it was engulfed in flames. What he later learned was that despite the fact that he couldn't smell the smoke, there was an electrical fire in the walls, and the house burned down. What if those times when you worry, what if they're not something to feel guilty for? What if it doesn't make you a bad Christian? But what if the goal is that those are alarms that invite you into prayer to reaffirm and re-acknowledge and reconfess your trust in God? What I was supposed to do, and I totally forgot, was point you to those info cards and the pens. That's why they're annoyingly out in front of all of you. And just invite you to begin to write down, what's the stuff you're worrying about? What's the stuff where you realize you need to trust God more? See, we often don't pray because we don't know what to pray for. Well, what if you just started your day in a chair going, "God, here's my desires. I'm not claiming they're holy. I'm not claiming they're of you. I'm not even claiming they're of your will. Here's my desires. And simultaneously, I'm trusting you. And I'm not just saying I trust you generic. I trust you with my job. I trust you with this relationship situation. I trust you with this illness. I trust you with my grandma. I trust you." What would happen in our hearts, in our relationship with the Lord, if prayer became less about getting an otherwise reluctant God to do things that he doesn't want to do, and more about affirming to him our desires because he wants to know them, and affirming to him simultaneously, "But I trust you. Get me out of this, but not what I want. What do you want, Lord?" Let me pray for you. God, this prayer thing is so complex and so big, and yet we recognize that at the foundation of, Lord, what we're about and trying to be about is having a relationship with you and inviting that relationship to impact our lives and our community in practical ways. Thanks, God, that you already know what we need. That we don't have to get your attention, we don't have to get you an otherwise indifferent God to care, that you're already committed to our needs. Financial, occupational, relational, God, you know what they are. You're committed to meeting them already. We love you, Jesus. It's in your name that we pray.